critical week. It is the critical week in human history. And we began a passage last Sunday that has to do with what I feel at least is an honest inquiry. There's all these people who are coming along and they're asking Jesus all these questions, and they're not honest questions. They're trying to trip him up. They're trying to make him look bad. They're trying to ask him, so what right do you have to come up in front of us and preach? What right do you have to come and bring us a message from God? And Jesus keeps coming up with brilliant answers. And in the midst of their debate and discussion, they're asking, so what are we going to ask him next? What are we going to say to him next? And his scribe, a lawyer, steps forward, and I believe by the reaction that Jesus gives, asks a question that's coming out of what they're talking about, but it's a different kind of question. The question is this. So Jesus, what's the most important law? And really, the reason why he's asking, what's the base law? What is the nation of Israel's version of a constitution? What is the law that all others are built upon? And this was something they discussed about. And I think this scribe is asking this question to say, okay, Jesus, are you really one of us? Do you understand what God has been doing? And I'm trying to figure out what side you're on. And Jesus looks at him and says, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God. And then he goes through a version of Deuteronomy chapter 6. He gives a little bit of a paraphrase. But he basically says, with all of your being, love God. Know God. And the more you know God, the more you will learn to love God. The more you know about God, the more you will love him. That is the bottom line. John Piper, an American pastor and writer, wrote this. The weakness of our hunger for God is not because he is unsavory. In other words, not because there is something wrong with God, but because we keep ourselves stuffed with so many other things. In other words, we sometimes fail to love God because our hearts are focused on 1,000 other things than knowing God. We're going to come to the second part today of this whole passage. Love your neighbor as yourself. How do you talk about this in a fresh way? I started at the beginning of the week really looking at that, saying, okay, yeah, love your neighbor. Okay, everybody's heard this one before. So I started going around trying to find other people who preached on this passage and what have others said. And I came across a story. It's an interesting story because it's one in which there's some things that are kind of get some truth misconstrued and yet end in a beautiful place. It's a story of an old monastery in Europe, way out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. At one point in time, it was a place of importance. It was a great order. But as the years had gone on, this place had become, as often is the case with these things, had become self-seeking, always looking at themselves. And it started to shrink until it got to the place where there was only 5 old monks living in this place. And all they did was spend their days worrying about, well, why are we just a bunch of old people and nobody else is following and nobody else is joining us and nobody cares anymore. They started worrying and worrying and worrying. One day, the leader, the abbot, decided that, you know what, we need some outside advice. And they knew that nearby was a little retreat, a little one-room place out in the woods, and every once in a while this old rabbi from the city would come out, and he would come and use this little shack as kind of a retreat. And they have this way of kind of just always figuring out when he was in the woods. So he went out there one day and he sat down with the rabbi and said, you know, all these years you come out to the woods and we live out nearby, we've never actually talked or met. Can I ask you some questions? And so he proceeded to tell him the story of how everything was going wrong. And the rabbi looked at him when he was finished the story and said, I know exactly what you're going through because I go through the same worries. In the city, it's the same way. The Spirit has gone out of people. No one comes out to the synagogue anymore, and I don't know what to do. The old abbot, the old rabbi, they kind of commiserated together, they wept together. And after a period of time, I got up to leave, and the abbot said, you know, it's wonderful that we should finally meet after these years, but do you have nothing to say that would bring peace to my soul today? The rabbi responded, no. The only thing I can tell you is at least the Messiah is in your midst. And what he meant by that, of course, was that Jesus, the Messiah, the church believed in that. But you know what? He didn't get that. He misunderstood what the rabbi was trying to say. And he went back to his order and he sat down with these four other elderly men and they started talking about, well, what do you think he meant by that? Do you think he means that one of us holds the key to our survival? That one of us has been taught in a remarkable way, that one of us, really, that Jesus has done something extraordinary with? I started all thinking and contemplating. You know, maybe our head abbot here. Maybe God is really doing something extraordinary in his life. I mean, he's been our leader for a generation. And then maybe they started thinking, maybe Brother Thomas over there. I mean, he's an extraordinary patient person. Maybe that's who this rabbi was talking about. Or maybe this brother over here is a little grumpy sometimes, but he often gets it right. And as time went on, instead of spending their time focusing on what was going wrong, they started to ask the question more and more and more, what is God doing right in this person's life? And the more they focused on what was God doing in their life, the more their problems seemed to fall away. And the less and less they worried about what the future held and what was happening here and why weren't people listening. The more they looked for Jesus in their neighbors, the more they found him. The more they found him. There is great potential when we're keeping our eyes open for where God's love is at work. It is so easy to be negative. And when we're treating each other as Christ himself would treat us, the more that we can learn to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Last week I left us with 3 questions. And I said this is the key to really, do we want to know God? Do we want to love God? How do we answer these questions? Is God interested in me right now? Does God care about me? And is God strong enough? And our answer to those questions leads us back towards who is God. And I left us there saying we need to learn to love God on the basis of the fact that we know that God is interested in me right now. He cares about where I'm at, and He is strong enough to act in my life. But I didn't fully answer how we make the jump to then loving God. Jesus does. The first command was the Lord your God, the Lord is one. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is a quotation from Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19 is a series of short commands that include things like don't endanger your neighbor's life. Don't go out and slander people. Don't seek revenge. Don't bear a grudge against people. And in the midst of all these short little commands, Moses tells the people from God, this is what God says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. The rabbis, teachers of the law, they never put this together with the passage out of Deuteronomy that says, Lord your God, the Lord is one. But Jesus takes this knowledge of God that leads to a love of God and then says it's all mixed together with how we treat those around us. Love your neighbor. What is the definition of loving your neighbor? I came up with a couple of things. Let's put them up here. I think if we don't love our neighbor, we serve without expectation. So often, we do good things for people and we expect at least a thank you, or some praise, acknowledgement. Want our egos boosted a little bit. Instead, I think if we are to truly love our neighbor, whoever that may be, and by the way, neighbor does not just mean somebody who lives next door. We're going to find that out a little bit. It can mean our families. It can mean spouses. It can mean children. It can mean parents. It can mean almost anybody, really. It's just harder at families sometimes. Serve them. Help them out. Put them first without expectations. Secondly, encourage deliberately. Go out of our way to build people up. It's really hard to tear people down when we're building them up. It takes intentionality, doesn't it? It's really easy to say negative words. It is a lot harder to say positive words. Thirdly, celebrate victories in people's lives. We don't do this a lot. I gotta tell you, sometimes people come into my office, way too rarely, and say, you know what? Here's something good that's happening. I gotta tell you, I get a lot of energy when that happens. So it's amazing. We need to spend some more time celebrating when good things happen. And fourthly, default to forgiveness. It is really easy to default towards suspicion that if somebody has done me wrong, they are going to continue to do wrong. I said earlier, I gave this quote from John Piper. The reason why we don't get excited about our hunger for God, the reason sometimes why we forget to be so hungry for God is because we hold on to things. Bitterness and things like that are things we often hold on to. What are we at? The 17th? Is that the date today? 18th? 18th. 18th of January. That means we're done, what, about 1/24 of the year? Just a little bit over that. We are just over a half a month into the year, and I gotta tell you that I have had many people already in 2015, multiple people, who have told me that at one point in their life they were very happy in their marriage or their family or in life, and then something happened and they cannot forgive it. Okay, I've heard that multiple times, and we're less than a month into the year. 2015 alone. Do you know what that tells me? It's a problem. It's a problem. If we cannot forgive, if we have to hold on to bitterness, if we have to hold on to unforgiveness, if we have to hold on to something that somebody did to me, I'm going to tell you, we are never going to get to the point where we can love. It's a problem. But when we release these, it's remarkable that we can be drawn back into the love of Jesus, and then draw others into the love of Jesus because we love as well. George MacDonald said this great. God is the God of the beautiful. Christianity is the love of the beautiful. Heaven is the home of the beautiful. God is not the God of hate, or the God of bitterness, or the God of arrogance, or the God who wants us to hold on to what is unhappy. God is the God of all things good. Scribe said to him, "You're right, teacher. You've truly said that he is one, and there is no other beside him, and to love him with all your heart, and with all your understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." Well said! Know God, love him, love others. I think a light bulb's just gone on in this man's life. Yeah, do you know what? I was trying to find out, who are you really? Are you on our side? Do you know the law? Do you understand the Bible? And yeah, you've explained it brilliantly. Well said. Of course. There is a very similar question we find in the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus answers in the same way, and then the man who answers the question in Luke follows it up and says, "So who's my neighbor?" And Jesus tells a parable that I bet you've all heard before. We call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's quite a twisting story. It's quite a remarkable story, where two gentlemen who are too busy doing the work of God run past an injured man, and then somebody who is part of a group that is known for twisting the truth, who are abhorrent to anybody who is orthodox, who are known for doing wrong and skipping church. He stops and helps a man that the others don't have time for. Those who pass by the injured man are rushing off to do their religious duties. They would argue that the man who stopped to help was in the wrong because he should have been going off to church. That's where they were going. Now, I don't like that because I don't want to get up here and tell you to skip church. In fact, that's not what I'm saying. not all what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is where are our priorities? They're all worried about the technicalities of the law. They cannot stop because there's something that is much more important than this injured man. What they don't understand is Christianity is not all about what we do or do not do. It's about knowing God and loving God and then learning to love each other. It's amazing how everything else falls away when we know God. They're trying to run off to please God. If I offer the right sacrifices, I can make God happy. I can force God to like me if I do the right things. It's supposed to all be about love and grace and mercy. As I look at this passage, in the end, this scribe answers, you know what, you're right. All this stuff about love is more important than whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Many people have read that, and they've compared the story of the Good Samaritan and wondered. Gospel of Mark does not record every word Jesus says. It can't. It's a short book. And many have wondered, did Jesus retell the story of the Good Samaritan at this point? He very likely did. It seems very likely because why else would this gentleman have then finished with this whole bit about burnt offerings and sacrifices being less important than love? Because that's the whole point of that story. Answering a very similar question. Good Samaritan story. I have to go to please God, so I can't help you. I am not sure that I'm truly loved by God. So I have to go do these acts to make sure that God will love me. Do you know what? The more secure we are in Jesus, the more we are able to love. The more secure we are in Jesus, the more we're able to love. We cannot fully love. We are caught up into unforgiveness, arrogance, superiority, a desire to bring punishment, or apathy. All these things create barriers in our spiritual lives. Over and over again, in the Gospel of Mark, it comes back to this whole, if you can't forgive, you can't be forgiven. That comes up over and over again in the Gospels. Why is it's because it's such a critical message. I'm going to tell you, our world and the church even needs to hear this message over and over again, that we need to strive towards finding ways to forgive and get past hurts, because otherwise we'll never be the church that God created us to be. It's just emphasized over and over again in the Gospels, and it's coming up again here. Do you know what? If we're caught up in our own things, the fullness of the love of God just cannot flood our hearts. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask questions. Some people have looked at that and just, kingdom of God, you're either in or you're out, aren't you? How can he be not far? And I think what's happened is a light bulb has gone on in this man's head. It makes sense. What Jesus is saying makes sense. Years ago, I remember a speaker saying, you know what? The distance from heaven to hell is about 12 inches. The difference from the head to the heart, depending on how tall you are. It's great to have intellectual knowledge. It's got to penetrate our very inner being. It's got to come in here. And I think my bet is, if we were to flesh this out, how I read it, is I think, good job. You've got the intellectual part. Now take that last step. Take that last step of commitment to journeying with Jesus. You get the idea. You've got it. It's on the tip of your tongue. Take the next step. Love Jesus and grab onto forgiveness. And it destroys the confidence of those who are standing on the side of just religious tradition is what matters. Because they won't ask him any more questions. He's taken what they are holding as important and he slammed it aside. Do you know what? We can hold on to so many things. Do I worship God with the right music? Do I go to does my church have the right denominational label on the door? Do I have the right ethical response in all situations? And Jesus blows it away by saying, here's what matters. Know God, love God, and in the midst of all this, we love our neighbors as ourselves. Take the step to know God fully. How do we do it? Do you know what? It's a complicated answer in some ways, but it's a simple answer in others. We need to journey together to discover the beauty of God. Sometimes I don't love my neighbor. And sometimes knowing God becomes secondary because there's so much other things going on. I don't have all the answers to life. But I do know this. The more the church journeys together towards knowing God and helps each other keep on the right path and encourages one another and work on it together, in humility we are able to stand before Jesus and we can look to him and find love together. It starts with taking that step that this man needed to take. Saying, yeah, this sounds good, and moving towards where it penetrates your heart. And the next steps we do together as we continue to know God all the better. And the more we know God, bigger difference it makes. So I'm going to invite a worship team to come forward. We're going to sing a song.